On today's Film and Whiskey, we pit two Irish distillers head-to-head. We try 3 whiskeys from Clonakilty and 3 more from Athrú from Lough Gill Distillery. That's all ahead on Film and Whiskey. Hey everybody, welcome into the podcast. We are back with another special bonus episode. Brad, this bonus episode is one that I am incredibly amped for because it's not too often we get to do a bonus episode centered solely on drinking whiskey. You know, we usually wrap up our whiskey reviews in some sort of like a top 5 or something like that. Today is all whiskey all the time, my friend.
And not only is it all whiskey all the time, it is all Irish whiskey all the time. And Bob, you know from the very start of this podcast that there's always just been a soft spot in my heart for Irish whiskey. And I feel like we've kind of run the gambit on whiskeys, but we have not spent a lot of time in the Emerald Isle. And so for me, today is just a really special day. I am so excited to try these Clonakiltys and Athrú whiskeys.
Yeah, so here's what we're going to do today. We have been in contact with a couple Irish distilleries. One is called Athrú and one is called Clonakilty. And they each sent us a sample package that had 3 whiskeys each. And we got them in the mail and said, oh my gosh, like this was not our original intention. So sorry to the distilleries, but we have to go head to head on these whiskeys. I mean, it just seemed like, you know, kismet. It's fate.
Well, it's the American thing to do.
A fight to the death. What could be more
capitalism.
American than a duel?
That's right.
So what we're going to do today is we're going to just go 1, 2, 3 in the order that these are in the boxes that we have. We're going to go head to head, each Athrú and each Clonakilty. First of all, Brad, I have to say, I love saying the word Athrú.
Oh, dude. It takes me back to when we were studying like Hebrew back in the day, and you just get these words that are just awesome. And I wish that English had like better enunciation of certain like syllables and words that we just don't have. But yeah, Athrú is just a freaking cool name.
I had to look it up because the way it's spelled is Athru. So you'd think it would be Athrú, but with that nice kind of Gaelic thing behind it, you know, they pronounce it as like A and then HR. So it's like Athrú. You have this nice like wind escaping your mouth as you say it. Brad, I am rambling on at this point. We need to sample some whiskeys. But before we do, I want to give a little refresher on Irish whiskey. Because like you said, we don't drink it enough on this show. We've had a few Irish whiskeys. But, you know, being in America, we have bourbon and rye way more readily available to us. I'm with you, man. The more we drink Irish whiskey, the more I like it. I think if I had to pick my 2 favorite varieties of whiskey at this point, it would be bourbon and Irish whiskey. Even more than rye, even more than Scotch. I love a good Irish whiskey. And from the very beginning of our podcast, when we barely knew what we were talking about with whiskey, the word we kept coming back to describe Irish whiskeys was bright. There is just something so light and fruity about them that it's just such a refreshing kind of palate cleanser when you're used to drinking deep, dark bourbons all the time. I think that's what makes me love Irish whiskey so much.
Yeah, I mean, it really jumps to the other side of the spectrum for you. Like, there's floral notes, there's like citrusy notes, there's all sorts of like great, fun, lighthearted notes that you get off of these Irish whiskeys that I don't know, man. I've always been stuck on Irish whiskeys ever since it was just me drinking like Jameson and ginger ale. And it's always been something I care for.
Part of the reason that we get those notes on Irish whiskey is because most Irish whiskey is triple distilled. Now, we know that like bourbon, rye are usually double distilled. They have a thing in the column still called a doubler. But Irish whiskey is usually triple distilled. And what that means is that through that third distillation, it takes out more of the kind of water-soluble things that might get into the product. And what's left behind is those lighter, fruitier notes. So we have that distillation process to thank. Brad, I want to quiz you real quick. I want to see how much you remember about Irish whiskey.
Okay.
How do you think you're going to do?
I think I'm going to do phenomenal like I do at everything, Bob.
So Irish whiskey and Scotch whiskey are very similar in terms of what it requires legally to be called Irish whiskey. So Brad, knowing what we know about Scotch, knowing what we know about Irish, what can you tell me, just off the top of your head, what do you think it takes to be called Irish whiskey?
Got to be distilled in Ireland.
Boom, there's one.
Nailed it.
Where does it have to be aged?
I would imagine it has to be aged in Ireland.
It does. 2 for 2.
Oh, man.
For how long?
I don't think that it needs to be done with like wood from Ireland. I'm guessing that you can use any type of wood finish.
Correct.
I would imagine 2 years seems to be like a pretty standard mark in the whiskey world for like saying that it was aged in an area. So I'll say 2 years.
It's actually 3 years. So Scotch and Irish have to be aged 3 years in their country of origin. I think it's the same with Japanese whiskey now. They're actually finalizing those rules for Japanese as well. It also has to be made up of either completely malted cereal, what we call barley, or a combination of other grains. And that's where we get into, it has the same terminology that you might find with Scotch, where you'll see on a bottle that it says single malt or single grain or blended malt or blended grain. Brad, do you remember the distinctions there?
Nope.
Cool.
Go for it.
I'm going to go as fast as I can because this stuff gets boring. Single malt, when you see that on a bottle, what it means is that the word malt means that it is completely made up of barley. That's the only thing in the mash bill. If it says grain, that means it's a combination of barley and other things. The word single means that it is the product of one single distillery. So it's not, people sourcing whiskeys and blending them all together. So single malt means one distillery only made up of barley. The cool thing with Irish whiskey is that they actually have another category that you'll see on the bottle sometimes, and that is called single pot still whiskey. Now, Brad, we actually encountered this when we tried Redbreast way back in season 1, and not knowing anything about Irish whiskey, I made an offhanded comment like, what's that supposed to mean, single pot still? It's actually a whole category of Irish whiskey, and I was just too dumb to do the research at that point. The cool thing about single pot still whiskey is that back in the day, Irish whiskey had taken off and it was bringing a ton of money into the Isles. And of course, the British government wanted to tax the hell out of it. So they wanted their cut. And so they started levying a huge tax on malted barley so that they could get a bunch of money out of the Irish whiskey process. And the Irish, as we all do, truly, truly hated the British. And they said, screw you guys. We're going to find another way to do this. And so what they started doing was they started mixing their malted barley in with unmalted barley, what's called green barley. And so their mash did not completely consist of malted barley anymore, so they could save money in the process. And what they found was it's actually just as delicious. So they use that mash in pot stills because it gives it that nice character that you get. I'm going to use the word, Brad. It gives it a nice funk. And that's how we got single pot still Irish whiskey, because we all hate the Brits and we avoid their taxes.
So it was their version of the Tea Party, basically.
Yeah, pretty much, man.
Yeah, I'm in. Good job, Ireland.
Well, Brad, now that we've had a refresher on Irish whiskey, I say it's time for us to do some drinking, my friend. So I think what we'll do is we're going to go in order of these sample packs that we have. And that means that we are going to pit the first Athrú, which is their Knocknarea, up against the Clonakilty single batch double oak. Brad, we have both of these poured out in front of us right now. What are you picking up here on this Athrú Knocknarea?
Well, first off, I'm picking up the fact that that's a freaking cool name. And not only that, but it has some fantastic notes going on in the nose here. It feels deep, it feels dark, it feels fruity. Like, I feel like it almost smells like woody, like almost like a fir tree. There's a lot of really cool stuff going on here that I'm really interested in.
Yeah, Brad, so what we're dealing with here is actually a 14-year-old single malt whiskey that is finished in Oloroso sherry barrels. Now, we know that sherry is huge for finishing both Irish and Scotch whiskey, but one of the first things that really stood out to me on the nose was just how much this smells. It has a very particular kind of like Highland Scotch kind of smell to it, and it really triggered my memory all the way back to season 1 when we tried the Glenmorangie La Santa. It has a ton of that going on. So I went back and looked at the La Santa, and yeah, that was actually also finished in Oloroso sherry barrels. I got a ton of sherry on this. It was very bright. It had that nice kind of like coastal smell to it. I don't know how else to describe it. And then after a while, it kind of sat, and I had this note of salted caramel And Brad, working in an office all day, I get these weird kind of nosing notes sometimes from all the different things I'm smelling. But like when you open a fresh ream of like printer paper, that was in here. I was like, oh man, it's got this nice, not just woodsy smell, but like actually fresh paper smell to it. I know that sounds weird. It's a really cool note to pick up on the nose here. If I was scoring it out, I'd give this about a 7 on the nose.
Yeah, I think it's a really beautiful nose. I'm probably in a similar spot, maybe 7, 7.5. But as I get into the flavor, I just think that there is so much going on here. You have all these fruit notes. It feels deep and dark, and I think it gets that from the fir tones that I was picking up on the nose. And you're right. It has a papery feel to it that I'm fascinated by. It's really interesting. It's still, even with the depth that I'm experiencing, it still feels kind of bright and Irishy. I am a big fan of this flavor. I think I'd probably give it an 8 out of 10.
Yeah, I'm actually more impressed than you, man. It's crazy. It's like night and day from the nose. You're getting like those classic Irish whiskey notes on the nose, and then you go to sip it, and it is like this dark, decadent. It's like eating cake. It's crazy. Actually, the note that I wrote down was this tastes exactly like the experience of drinking a caramel macchiato. You get that initial wave of just like intensely dark, almost like that Starbucksy caramel sauce on the front of your tongue, and then it finally develops the spice, and when you go to swallow, it is nothing but just really dark, sweetened espresso. This thing is beautiful, man. I'm going to give this a 9 out of 10 on the taste.
Yeah, I would probably put it out there. This is one of the better Irish whiskeys I've ever had. And it's due to its complexity. Like, if there's ever a knock against the Irish whiskeys I've had, it feels like they don't have a lot of complexity, that they're always a lot lighter, that they don't have a lot of viscosity. But this one checks a few of those boxes, and I'm pretty impressed. What do you think about the finish here, Bob?
Yeah, I mean, it's long-lasting. There's a nice tingle on your tongue that's left behind, and the notes that stay behind are primarily, for me, it's still caramel, and it is espresso. It's a really interesting Irish whiskey, one that I've never tried before. You know, if I had to give it a score, Brad, I'd probably say it was between a 7.5 and an 8. If I had to give the balance a score, I'd probably say that's, an 8 or an 8.5. This is one of the more impressive Irish whiskeys I've ever tried, Brad.
Yeah, I really like it a lot. If I had to give it a score out of 40, 10 points for nose, taste, finish, and balance, I probably would end up in like the 31 to 33 area. Mm-hmm. It's a really solid above average, like 75 to 82 out of 100 area.
Yeah. But here's the thing, like, it doesn't necessarily blow you away in many areas. For me, the flavor did. But it is so wildly different than a lot of what's on the market right now in Irish whiskey that I could see myself coming back to this as if it was a 40 out of 40. So, Brad, I think we're off to a good start here. Let's try this Clonakilty. This is their single batch double oak. Now, this is a blend of 8-year and 10-year whiskeys, one of which is a single malt and one of which is a grain whiskey. Brad, when I smell this, I don't know how else to explain it, but oftentimes we talk about young grains. And yes. I think the prime example for us of young smelling whiskey, and I hate to keep throwing them under the bus, but it was just such a good example, was that St. Liberty whiskey that we tried. And it just has this really distinct smell to it. And I think when it gets even younger than that, I always get this note that's like a chemical cleaner called Tarnex, and it smells like that sometimes. This one doesn't quite tip that far into it. I think the triple distilling, the Irish whiskey process is really helping this one out. But for me, all I'm getting is young grains and then a lot of pear or, some sort of lighter fruit note. But for me, it's pear.
Yeah, there's a tiny bit of fruitiness here, but overall, I'm getting a lot of grain, and I was amazed to hear you use the words 8 and 11 year, because I agree, Bob, it has a young aroma to it, a young, grainy aroma that I'm not super impressed with, unfortunately.
One time I heard somebody describe that aroma as wet cardboard, and I actually think that's a pretty apt description. Like if you have ever broken down boxes or smelled one that got left out in the rain, there is a very particular smell to it. And I think that's present here. On the taste, It's pear again for me. It's just a spiced alcoholic pear beverage. And I like it. It's really pleasant. It's just not very complex. And I think especially coming off of that Athrú, this one it's very pleasant. It's very mild. I think it's a great Irish whiskey, like to introduce somebody to the world of whiskey, to the world of Irish whiskey. But compared to that first one, man, it just doesn't stack up.
Yeah, it really doesn't. And as I get into the flavor of this, it just kind of, this is just going to sound harsh, Bob, so I'm just going to say it. It just tastes like a young, watered down version of a good Irish whiskey. Mm. Like, I don't know how else to say it other than that there's not really any notes that are distinct or stick out. It just feels like kind of a young Irish bright whiskey that I'm not blown away by.
So all of the Clonakiltys we're drinking today are 87.2 proof, and all of the Athrús are 96 proof. So there is a little bit of a proof difference there. It's about 10 proof points higher. But this one, it's not necessarily that it seems low proof or watery or anything like that. It just lacks a certain character. And you know, Brad, if I had to score this out, like I think 6s pretty much across the board for me. It's enjoyable. It's pleasant. It's definitely not something I would turn my nose up at, but it just doesn't compare to the Athrú for me. And so I think for me, round one's winner is that Knocknarea.
Yeah, for me too. I would probably come out in the 21 to 24 area for the Clonakilty. So yeah, let's head on to round two though. Let's see if Clonakilty can fight back a little bit.
All right. So our round two matchup is the Athrú Anaconda. Oh, I like that one. I mean, I feel like you have to have like an anaconda as your logo for the Anaconda.
You know, all the anacondas that are on the Emerald Isle.
You know, yeah, sure. I thought St. Patrick drove them all away, but maybe there's one left behind. So this is also a 14-year-old single malt whiskey. It's finished in a combination of Pedro Jimenez and Oloroso sherry casks. So once again, very standard finishing process here. We get the combination of the PX barrels and the Oloroso sherry barrels here. Brad, what are you picking up on the nose of this Anaconda?
This one has a lot of nice, bright, florally notes on it. It's got kind of like a little bit of like a buttery feel to it. It smells very smooth. I don't know if anybody else has had that experience before, but it just smells like it's just going to go down easy.
Yeah, for me, this one is much, much softer on the nose than that first one, the Knocknarea was. Much less noticeable on the nose. I really had to kind of dig for this one, and I had to really get my nose down into the glass for that. And so there was a bit of sherry, a lot of alcohol for the proof point. I'm actually not a huge fan of the nose on this one, Brad, because I had to work so hard to try to get anything off of it that was like distinctive.
Yeah, but I mean, for me, as I get into the actual taste of this, I am like really fascinated with it. It's got all sorts of buttery caramel flavors with a lot of like florally notes hitting pretty hard for a light, airy whiskey. I really like this a lot. Not quite as much as the Knocknarea, but I'm really impressed with what Athrú is putting here in its Anaconda.
Yeah, I am as well, man. There are just waves of caramel on this for me. It's a really gorgeous palate. Lots. The end for me was like, I don't want to say like vermouth, but it definitely had that kind of like bitter fruit character to it. It had something of like a fortified wine to it for me. And then lots of dark chocolate on the end of the palate. I'd give it like at least an 8 on the flavor. The finish for me, it kind of kept that bitter fruit thing going. I had a lot of grapefruit on this. I don't know if you got that, Brad. It was kind of a weird combo because it was like the bitter citrus of a grapefruit and then also like dark chocolate and coffee, which don't necessarily go together, but it wasn't off-putting. It was just like, those are two interesting notes to pair with each other. Does that make sense?
Oh, 100%. The further I get into drinking this, I'm just really impressed with, once again, the complexity that's going on here. And I feel like this is like what you get if an Irish whiskey was trying to imitate bourbon, and not in like a lesser version imitation, but like, hey, like what if we took an Irish whiskey, tried to add some bourbon elements to it and see what happens? I think this is what you end up with.
Yeah, Totally agree. Brad, if I had to score this out, I mean, I think once again, I would be coming out maybe just slightly lower than I did with the Knocknaray, or maybe I just want to raise my score with the Knocknaray because it was so good. But this is definitely, like, if we're going out of 40, this is well over the 30 mark for me.
Yeah, easily above the 30 mark, maybe up close to 35. I love the butteriness on this whiskey, and I would buy it any day of the week.
All right, Clonakilty number 2. You, once again, have very stiff competition. This is their port cask finish.
Yeah, so this port cask finish, they use what they call a premium Irish malt. They mix it with a 9-year whiskey, and they finish it in these port casks. And you get a better nose than our first Clonakilty experience. I will say that. There's some fruit going on here. The grain does not smell nearly as young. I feel like this is something that I would actually want to write home about if I was Clonakilty. Like there's some stuff going on here that I'm enjoying.
Yeah, I definitely think this one, for me, the nose, it has a really kind of yeasty smell to it. And not like that it's, unaged mash, but it really smells like almost like pretzel dough to me. It has a really nice bready quality. I do still pick up a little bit of that young grain though, Brad. I don't know if you're picking up quite as much as I am. And I think once that note gets in my brain, it's one of those smells, I know that like you hate the smell and taste of pickles. Like the Tarnexy smell of young grains to me, it just like once I smell it, if I smell it on any other whiskeys the rest of the day, I'm like, ugh, it's like, I don't know, needling at me. So I'm definitely picking up a little bit of that here. You're right. It's not as bad as the first one in that regard, but it's still there.
Yeah, I was trying to be a little bit nice. It's still there, Bob. It still smells kind of like a young grain. And I don't know if that's just maybe like the Clonakilty funk, if I'm using a word that Bob likes to use.
The Clonakilty funk. What a band name.
I was literally just thinking the same thing. Like, oh, what a band, the Clonakilty funk.
Oh, man.
But yeah, it's just fine. Honestly, though, as I get into the flavor profile, it still tastes young. It still has that grainy feel to it, but you can sense that port cask finish. That gives it some nice red wine fruitiness that's enjoyable. It's very pleasant.
I will say this, we've had port casked finish whiskeys before. This one definitely goes way more bitter on the end than any of those did, because usually you get a nice sweet red wine finish. This one was milder in taste. It had some nice chocolatey notes for me. And then right at the end, I said with the Anacuna from Athrú, they kind of had that like fortified wine taste. This one just tastes like a very bitter wine to me. And I was surprised at how bitter it stayed on the finish. So, I mean, I don't know. Again, Brad, I don't know what you're thinking, but for me at least, I think Athrú wins this round as well with the Anacuna in kind of a runaway. I actually think I preferred the first Clonakilty, that single batch double oak, to this port finished one.
I think I'm a little higher on this port finish. For me, I'd probably put it in like a 25 to 27 area. It's got some nice notes going on, but you are correct in saying that the Athrú is leaps and bounds above the Clonakilty here.
All right, man. So it's already a majority win for Athrú, but let's go ahead and finish out our flights today. Athrú number 3 is called the Keshkorin.
Bro, the names for the Athrú are just really cool. Like obviously names are kind of like when you have a really cool packaging, and they don't really mean anything with the juice that's actually inside. But hey, man, good job, marketing team at Athrú. I'm proud of you guys.
Yeah, so this one is called the Athrú Keshkorin. It is, again, a 14-year single malt whiskey. This one is finished in Hungarian Tokaj casks. Now, I'm sure I'm not pronouncing that correctly. Tokaj is Tokaji. It's not Tokaji. My whole family's Hungarian. I should have asked them how to pronounce it, but I think it's Tokaj.
Yeah, I have no idea what you're talking about, Bob.
But apparently that is like a national spirit of Hungary. It is a wine kind of product that they make in Hungary. So this is aged in those kind of casks. Forgive me for not having the proper pronunciation, but I'm trying real hard with these Keshkorins and these Athrús today. So, Brad, what are we picking up on the nose of this third Athrú?
I think the dominating note for me on this is earthy. Like it just has like a fresh dirt, like freshly tilled earth standing out on the farm. type of feel to it that feels deep and important, and it just is nice. It's not like blowing me out of the water because of the fact that I don't feel like it's as complex as the first two noses we had with the Athrú. But overall, I would say that for a one-note whiskey, this one hits a nice note.
Yeah, I definitely think that when we started with the Knocknarea, we might have set ourselves up for, I don't want to say for failure. Like, this is a wonderful smelling whiskey, but I think that the Athrús have gotten less complex on the nose as we've gone. And for me, this one was definitely the most mild. It was the most mild. It was the most alcohol forward on the nose. There wasn't much going on here. I actually had a bit of like a petroleum, not a petroleum, but like a, almost like a gasoline-y type smell on this, kerosene or something. And it wasn't like offensive. It wasn't overwhelming, but it definitely had some elements that tipped into that sort of earthier, herbaceous, vegetal kind of side of things. It's very different from the other two that we've had, which doesn't necessarily mean anything because I think that these Athrús have been such an interesting roller coaster of nose to palate to finish. So I'm interested to see where it goes. I will say I think this is my least favorite nose of the three.
Yeah, I'm with you, because as I get into the actual flavor of the Keshkorin, it doesn't pack quite the same punch that the first two did. Yeah, it's earthy. There's a little bit of flowers going on, but there's not as much sweetness as was going on in the first two that I liked. It's not as good. Just not quite at the same level that the first two were.
Yeah, this one is definitely, and I think it's certainly intentional that this one leans into that earthier, herbal, vegetal kind of side of things, but it's very intensely bitter in parts. And it's not like, once again, I mean, I just, you can tell when something just goes off the rails in the development process, and you can tell when it's an intentional thing. And I can tell this is an intentional flavor profile they've built here. And it has to have something to do with the Hungarian casks they're being aged in. But it's not for me, if I can say it like that. I think it's still above average. I think it's still drinkable. I think it's still a nice experience. But it definitely is not like your easy sipping kind of Irish whiskey that you get on the more kind of Clonakilty side of things. This is a beast unto itself, if I can say it like that.
No, I totally agree with you. I think if I came out to a final score out of 40, this one would be probably in like the 28 to 30, maybe 31 range. What about you, Bob?
Yeah, Brad, I think I'd probably be about in the same place. This is the one that, like, you know, once we start talking about prices at the end of the show, this is probably the one that I would not shell out the money for. And especially when I hold it up next to the Knocknarea, which is it's certainly my preferred wheelhouse and flavor profile in general. Yeah, still above average, but I think Clonakilty, we have finally cracked the door open for you to come back and claim at least one category. So, Brad, we have this Clonakilty single grain Bordeaux cask finish here. Now, again, single grain means one distillery. It is made of a mixture of grains, not just barley. And they finish it in Bordeaux casks, which, you know, I'm excited for that. I think we've had one Bordeaux finish before. Maybe we haven't. A nice red wine finish. I am excited for that. Brad, what are we picking up on the nose here of this Bordeaux finish?
This one is like nice and fresh. Unfortunately, there's still a little bit of that young grain that seems to be characteristic of this distillery at this point. Almost similar to the Anacuna in its butteriness. Like, there's a nice light lilting feeling to this that reminds me of a white wine.
Yeah, Brad, I cannot escape that young grain smell. And I actually think this one was the most prominent of those. Like, and maybe it was just I was kind of expecting it when I got to the nose this time around, but I really got that kind of Tarnexy smell on this one. It's the youngest smelling of all of them to me, to be honest. And I hate to say this too, of all the Clonakilties, I think this one is the one that for me, the taste is just off. Like, there's something off about this one. It's young, it's thin, it's very bitter. You know, and again, on their website, it says they're using 9-year whiskey in this. Again, they're sourcing this whiskey. They just opened their distillery in 2018. I am very hopeful that as their own product starts to age, that it takes on more of the character of that product, because I just think that what they're sourcing here doesn't taste as developed as its age would suggest.
Yeah, I kind of agree with you. I think when I get into the taste of this one, it genuinely tastes kind of like a Chardonnay to me that's like lightly oaked. It's got a little bit of oakiness. It's got a lot of butteriness to it. Like you said, there's that young grain flavor that I can't get over either. It knocks it down so many pegs for me. But this one actually, I feel like is something that I could enjoy just by itself. So this one I think is in the mid 25 range for me. It's decent, and there are notes that I appreciate at the very least.
Yeah, I thought the finish on this was actually really nice. Even though I did not care for the flavor, it actually had we've been eating a lot of watermelon in my house lately. And like when you finally get down to the bottom of the watermelon as you're starting to get to the rind as you eat a slice of watermelon, it had a melon rind kind of flavor. So it had that earthiness to it with just a touch of fruitiness. I really liked the finish here. I think that there are good things to say about these Clonakilties, Brad, but this is, I think, where we have to start factoring in the price of each product. Now, in a lot of ways, this was an unfair matchup all around for the Clonakilty brand because Clonakilties all retail for about $59 US, which is, it's a pricey kind of premium Irish whiskey. It's certainly nowhere near the top end of what you'd pay for Irish whiskey, but $60 a piece, I think that's where I get very iffy on this, Brad, because we've had Irish whiskeys that cost less than this that I think are much more flavorful, that don't have that young grain taste or smell to them. So I don't know, man. What are you thinking of these at $60 a pop?
I think it's pretty overpriced. I'm going to come back to something we had ways earlier on the podcast, which is the Sexton. I mean, the Sexton is $35, and I think it's better than all three of these Clonakilty whiskeys.
Yeah, I probably agree.
So for me, I'm really struggling with fathoming paying $60 for any of these.
So here's why I said it was unfair to Clonakilty, because all of the Athrús retail for $172 each. So that is an incredibly premium Irish whiskey. That is getting up, that would be premium for Scotch whiskey. However, Brad, these are three of the most decadent Irish whiskeys I've ever had. And I would say, for me, this is just personally, if I could give my personal ranking of them, the Knocknarea would be my number one. And I would not even hesitate to go buy myself a bottle of that, even at the price point that it's at. The Anacuna, I really liked. I thought it was like lights out great. I don't know if I'd pay $172. And then the Keshkorin, it was just not my preferred flavor profile. So that would be my third one. Brad, knowing the price points that these are at, it is super premium. It is kind of prohibitively expensive for a lot of people. What do you think of the Athrús at their price point?
I think that anytime you're spending triple digits on a whiskey, it better be worth it. I think that the Knocknarea comes close to being worth triple digits, but I don't know if I would want to spend over $100 on it. So honestly, I like the Athrú, but I don't know if it's worth spending over $100 for.
Yeah, I get that, man. So here's what I'll say. Taking price out of the equation, the Athrús were delicious and fantastic. The Clonakilties are something that I think is certainly drinkable, and they are, I think the first one, that double cask finish, was really, really good as an introductory Irish whiskey, or for someone who's new to the world of whiskey in general. It was very mild, very inoffensive. I don't think those are worth the $60. I said I was going to take price out of the equation, and here I am again. But, Brad, if you had to rank them, rank the Athrús, rank the Clonakilties.
I think I would go Knocknarea, Anacuna, and then honestly, it's a mix of the Bordeaux and the Keshkorin.
Okay.
And then the other two, I think that the port finish is fine, and that the double oak just didn't do it for me.
Yeah, that's interesting. I definitely would have the same top two as you. I would definitely put the Knocknarea at number one. I'd put the Anacuna at number two. And then you're right. At number three, it's a toss-up for me. The Keshkorin is certainly complex. It's just like, I'm not feeling it. You know what I mean? But for me, the best Clonakilty was that number one, the single batch double oak. And then the other two, it's kind of a toss-up for those. So, I mean, hey, if we're talking moral victories here, Clonakilty might have the number three spot, right?
Yeah, maybe.
Okay. Well, listen, We always pledge that we are going to give open and honest reviews, unbiased reviews when companies send us their product to review. And we want to say thank you very much to Athrú and to Clonakilty. We're incredibly grateful to get to try all 6 of these whiskeys. I am always happy to go back to Ireland and try some of their wonderful whiskeys. Every time we get to try Irish whiskey on this podcast, I get very excited. So we do want to say, once again, thank you to both of these distilleries. If you've tried any of their products, the Clonakiltys or the Athrús, we want to hear from you and hear what you think. You can reach out to us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram at Film Whiskey.
Or leave us a voicemail. Let us know how you have felt about these whiskeys. You can reach us on our website, which is anchor.fm/filmwhiskey.
We'll be back on Monday with another regularly scheduled episode. But until then, I'm Bob Book.
I'm Brad G.
And we'll see you next time.